Hey, AP government, hopefully you're doing well. In this video, I want to talk about the conflict and compromises that's going to lead to our Constitution. This is somewhere right before we get to our Federalist Paper assignment. So if you've had a chance to look at the Federalist Papers, remember that's the activity, or excuse me, that was the documents, over 80 plus documents that were written in favor of the U.S. Constitution, right? So the Federalist Papers were written by a number of leaders. You have John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. They're going to all compile these documents to say, ratify the Constitution. So before we get to that, because I do have you analyze an assignment over some key ones that we look at in this course. And the course does want you to know some key Federalist Papers, number 10, number 51, number 47, and obviously the anti-Federalist paper as well. I want to talk about what led to that Federalist paper. You have to have a constitution first. So if you remember in the previous video, we said the Articles of Confederation was thrown out. It gave the states way too much power, and the federal government was basically unable to control the states. They had no revenue. There were a lot of problems. It was too weak. The founding fathers basically went too far in the extreme of decentralization of power after being under a very centralized rule of King George III. So think of this as a compromise. And again, something I just stressed to you guys over and over again, our country was based on compromise. Our country will only continue to exist if we're willing to compromise and work together, as opposed to not doing that, and then it's just conquering one party over the other. So let's talk about a couple things here with conflict and compromise. The first big area that's the founding fathers are going to try to address and discuss is going to be representation. And this is a big deal. If you remember, that was the battle cry of the founding fathers: no taxation without representation. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, it wasn't a fair system either. Every state was given one vote. But how are you going to balance out, like Rhode Island gets the same amount of votes as Virginia? It just wasn't fair. So they knew that this was a big topic that they had to address. And there's going to be some fighting that takes place here on this, okay? So let's talk about the fighting that happens. I guess, again, looking at representation, we're going to look at how they're going to be represented in the legislature, if I can move myself out of the way. And even what kind of legislature will there be? Right. And just in case if you are taking notes, I would recommend that you take notes on the things that are underlined. And I know you're like, Mr. Matthews, that's probably a lot. But these are the key things that I'm really trying to emphasize to you guys as we're talking about, how the Constitution was made in a very, balanced fashion, if you will, and taking into consideration big states, small states, Federalist, anti-Federalist, and whatnot, and learning from the Articles. So that would be the big question, is how are they going to be represented? There's definitely a battle between the big states and small states. And again, we think big states, we're only talking about the first 13 states here versus the small states. These are going to be your states, mostly up in the Northeast, Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Bigger states, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Philadelphia, right? Some of the ones that had a little bit larger population, this is where we're going to see more of a dispute. The Virginia plan is proposed by James Madison. Okay, but take a look. The Virginia plan is going to greatly favor big states, right? And of course, it's Virginia. Virginia was a big state then. So James Madison is going to offer up a plan. It's actually introduced by a guy named Edmund Randolph. But here we go. Here's what it says. It says we're going to have a bicameral legislature, and that means we have a two-house. Okay, but both houses are based on population. Well, there's a problem there because then you're automatically going to have the big states dominate both houses. But take a look at what else is put in this plan that if you're a small state, you're going to panic over. Okay, the lower house is based on popular vote. Okay, the upper house was chosen by the lower house. So once you dominate the lower house, and the big states would do this, they control both houses of government, both houses of Congress, if you will. But it gets more than that. Then both houses together will elect the other branches. And we can see how imbalanced this would be. The big states would take over the smaller house, the lower house, then take over the upper house, and then take over all of government. If we had this system today, states like California, New York, Texas are going to be the ones that have almost control of the entire government. And again, it would be very much an imbalance when it comes to like the smaller states. Okay? And again, obviously it favored the larger states because they would control the lower house, which then takes over all of government. Okay. The New Jersey plan was proposed by a guy named William Patterson. And I like to think of William Patterson as kind of like a smaller guy anyway. But he's a guy who's going to challenge this and say, no, we can't do this. In no way can we have a plan that we're going to give that much power to the big states. So he proposes a unicameral Congress, which is what they had under the Articles of Confederation. It was a one-house legislature, and basically one state, one vote, equal representation. Okay, think of the New Jersey plan as like Articles of Confederation 2.0, right? It's basically the same idea. We're just going to try to rehash it a little bit and maybe fix it up. And we're going to have a weak executive branch. Okay, debates are going to ensue on this for weeks. And here's where I would normally ask my actors and actresses to step up and help me read this next part, because this is really important that you get. And if you don't get this, it's fine. Feel free to laugh at Mr. Matthews. I'm going to try to explain this the best I can using my best British accent. So here we go. All right. So this is going to essentially be Edmund Randolph proposing the Virginia plan. Ready? Fair! The New Jersey plan allows the few to control the many. We will never allow that. And then here we go. Here's William Patterson. If that's your position, then my state is ready to lead this convention. And so will Maryland and Delaware. And here's Maryland. Here, here. Delaware. Hey, hey. Right? So we get this fight going on between the big states and the small states. And this does go on for weeks. And of course, what do we do with the articles? Well, we basically took it and we scrapped it. So if we walk away from this convention, there is no more government. There is no more United States. It's going to be individual states. And essentially, we would be more like Europe, because the states are not dissolved. There's just no national government that's going to be over the states. So this is a pretty big deal. Okay. So if we think about like the different plans here, again, both of them are going to have 3 branches of government, right? Obviously, New Jersey plans unicameral. It's going to favor the small states. Virginia plans a bicameral legislature, favors the big states. I like to think of it like a fight, right? You get like the big states and small states. And look, you get the little state of New Jersey here. It's sweating. It's scared. It's worried. What's going to happen next? And then whammo, bammo. Ooh, we're going to have an ideas proposed. And this is really, really interesting. We're going to start consider this thing that Roger Sherman proposes called the Great Compromise, right? And again, fabulous term here, because what they're going to do is say, let's come up with a plan that accommodates both. I like to think of this as kind of like the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I'm a huge fan of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. In fact, I actually wanted peanut butter and jelly sandwich to be at my wife's and I wedding, where I would stand up instead of doing like the unity candle. I would stand with my slice of peanut butter. She would take the slice of jelly, and we would merge the two together up in front of the altar in front of our church. She struck that one down pretty hard, but we did have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at my reception. It was awesome. Crunchy peanut butter, strawberry jelly. It was wonderful. Anyway, this is that kind of compromise. It is going to be strong and it's going to be significant. Basically, the Virginia plan, and I'm going to try to draw here a little bit, so bear with me. The Virginia plan is going to essentially become the House of Representatives. Right? And this is a plan in which states are given seats based on population. In fact, Virginia, right now, we have 11 members and 11 seats in Congress based on our population. Right? The New Jersey plan is going to be based on equal representation and the idea that every state is going to be guaranteed 2 of these. So it doesn't matter how big, how small. There's 2 senators in California, just like there's 2 senators in Rhode Island. Okay, so you have one that represents the people and one that represents the states. Again, a pretty genius idea here that merges these 2 ideas together. Okay, and ultimately that's what we have. We have the House and we have the Senate. So kind of see that process go through, I think is really fascinating, because they both decided, or at least Roger Sherman said, listen, let's have our cake and eat it too, if you will. Let's have our peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and let's work on a compromise. And they came up with one. Okay. So Roger Sherman in Connecticut, the Connecticut Compromise, you ever heard of that? I'm sure you have. It's called the Great Compromise. Basically says lower house is based on population, and then the upper house is equal representation. Now we can can talk about how, like, who's going to vote for this group and whatnot, because that changed a little bit over time. But those are your two big houses. Okay. All right. The next big issue of compromise that took place is not between big states and small states, but more based between northern states and southern states. And southern states were basically in this convention, and they went in knowing that, listen, if we're going to get rid of slavery, they're out, and they're going to, like, leave the country, if you will. Right. So again, this is a terrible, terrible issue in American history. We know what happened with the Civil War and how we fought a war to ultimately over this issue to end this. And then we have, the Jim Crow era and the civil rights. And again, this is just part of our history that we have to keep this. We can't forget about, if you will. But this was actually part of the Constitution, is to allow for slavery. Right. So slaves are going to be counted in the population basically as a 3/5 compromise. And again, extremely racist, extremely just, anti-human policy to say that person is not even a whole person. They're 3/5 of a person. Well, this is what the compromise was made to get the southern states to stay on board in the country, if you will, to say, okay, your population of slaves are going to be given, we'll give you seats in our representation in our Congress, in the House, but it's based on 3/5. Okay. And again, states are going to pay the taxes on them at the same rate. And again, it's just a terrible, terrible compromise. Not all compromises are good, but this was done in a way to try to keep the northern and southern states aligned and keep the southern states from basically leaving the country. Following what I want to talk about is commerce. Okay. What role would Congress play in commerce? And this is really important because when we look at the Constitution, there's a couple clauses in there that puts Congress first and foremost in charge of what's called interstate commerce. Okay. South concerned that the slave trade might be stopped. And they basically said, we're not going to touch this thing for about 20 years. Okay. So for 20 years, you get to have your slavery practices. We're not going to get involved. And then we see what happens about 20 years later. This is when you start getting into all sorts of issues. With freedom and those things where obviously states are going to be breaking away from being a slave state. Congress is going to be given control over foreign and interstate commerce. Now, this is key. Interstate is between states. So this is like from Virginia to Maryland. The trade between those states, that's an interstate. When you get on an interstate, that's a road that goes between states. Okay. Intrastate commerce would be like trade between Lynchburg and Roanoke. A state had control over that kind of commerce. Congress has control over interstate commerce, something that you need to jot down because we're going to come back to it over and over again. This is what's giving Congress the ability to pass laws that deals with people travel. In fact, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that says you cannot discriminate against African Americans in your private buildings and your practices, they're going to justify that whole decision and that law by the Interstate Commerce Act. And so we'll talk about the difference between a court case called Heart of Atlanta. It's a really good one we'll talk about. Okay. Versus U.S. And Heart of Atlanta was basically a hotel that says we don't want African Americans in our hotel. It's whites only. They challenged the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act. And Supreme Court's going to say, no, the Civil Rights Act is constitutional because of the Interstate Commerce Clause that allows them to pass laws that deals with, businesses that benefit from the roads, from the states, and from traffic and whatnot. Okay, so we'll compare that one to another case that's really good called U.S. versus Lopez. And I won't go too much in the details on this one, but U.S. versus Lopez is a court case that's basically saying, is it constitutional to say that the federal government can basically say, if you bring a gun to school, it's a federal crime, right? And of course, bringing a gun to school is terrible. But the question is that a federal crime or is that a state crime? Well, the federal government's going to pass a law called the Gun School, or Gun-Free School Zone Act of like 1990. And there's a guy who brought a gun to school and he was charged with a federal crime. And he challenges this ultimately, and he's going to prevail. Now, he's still brought up on charges with state level, but you can't say that school is commerce, right? And the idea of what is commercial activity is something that gets picked apart quite a bit in the court cases, and we'll talk about that some more, okay? Also, Congress can now impose on intrastate commerce, and like I said, North touched slavery for at least 20 years. Okay, guys, so those are the three big areas of compromise: representation, slavery, and commerce. I'm going to end off on this video because you're probably getting tired of hearing me talk. I'll pick up next and I'll talk about, well, then what does the Constitution look like after that? And you're going to do a scavenger hunt activity for me here soon. So we'll have a chance to let you go through the Constitution and find a lot of really good information that we can pull back and say, this is actually put in the Constitution to try to deal with the problems of the Articles of Confederation. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you next time. Goodbye.